Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this ECA first full webinar. I'm Geri Freedman with Elders Climate Action, and we've had an energizing month in supporting youth and standing with them in the climate strike that took place on September 20th. So we're not going to lose that energy. And today's webinar is going to take us to the next step in our climate action. Today, elders declare a climate emergency is a next step for action. So before we start, I just want to give you a little bit of information. If you hover across the bottom of your screen, we'll have the presentations, and then at the end, we'll have time for Q&A. At the bottom of the screen, there is a Q&A box. You can put your questions in there, and we'll get them answered at the end. And then to the right of that is a chat box. If you wish to add any information or have any conversations, you can do that in the chat box. So we're going to get started. We have a full agenda. We have 4 presenters. So I just want to let you know, first up is Carol Kiparsky from Palo Alto. She's a retired writer, technical writer, and she's lived in Palo Alto for 35 years. And is the mother of 2 adult children and 2 grandchildren and a cat. So I have 2 grandchildren and a dog, so we're very similar. So I'm going to turn this over now to Carol, who's going to start this webinar off.
Hi. So what impels me to treat climate change as an emergency and to urge you to do so? For the past 35 years, I've been regularly hiking Bay Area trails. One trail system in particular, Windy Hill, in case you're familiar with the area, has become a dear old friend. It is heavily wooded, shaded by oaks, madrone, bay, and more. It winds through several mini-climates. Wildflowers like Indian warrior and paintbrush, nettles, iris, and so many more abound. Mushrooms, turkey tails, reishi, even a few chanterelles. Wildlife include deer, hares, bobcats, many kinds of birds, ticks, and so forth. So some years ago, I cannot say exactly how many this is, as it's an insidiously slow process, I began to notice changes. Some trees lost limbs, especially oaks. Some died. The trail became sunnier. Indian paintbrush appeared on slightly lower elevations. The bark of some oaks took on strange appearance, and oddly regular squares of bark fell to the ground. So I was concerned. One day I noticed the Indian paintbrush had crept to the lowest reaches of the trail. The turkey tail mushrooms had dried up on their logs. I hardly saw a deer anymore. And now I see so much sky. Cannot believe it. My old friend is sick, as is my parent, my planet. I'm alarmed. For us elders, nothing quite alarms us as the prospect of disaster facing our grandchildren and our friends, all of our grandchildren. On Climate Strike Day, my granddaughter concluded her speech with, "To all adults who do not care about climate change, grow up." The children in our life clearly see that climate change is an emergency. It is our job to join them and pressure our governments at all levels to treat it as one. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. I think we all have situations where we've seen these changes that just break our hearts. And especially with having grandchildren, you look at these changes and you say that these grandchildren are never going to see what we saw. And it is heartbreaking. Moving on, I'd like to introduce you to Margaret Klein Salamon, who is the founder and executive director of the Climate Mobilization. In this role, she's helped catalyze a burgeoning worldwide climate emergency movement. Margaret earned her PhD in clinical psychology from Adelphi University and also holds a BA in social anthropology from Harvard. Though she loved being a therapist, Margaret felt called to apply her psychological and anthropological knowledge to solving climate change. She's the author of The Transformative Power of Climate Truth and Leading the Public into Emergency Mode. Her forthcoming book, Transform Yourself with Climate Truth, will help readers process the emotional, psychological elements of the climate crisis and rise to the challenge of our time. Margaret, thank you so much for doing this, and over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I view this as a really important opportunity. I think that elders really do have something important and special to add to this climate emergency movement. So yeah, thank you for having me and watching. So as Geri said, I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and that is also even before I was studying that, that's like my kind of my background. My father's a psychoanalyst. Like most of our family friends were psychoanalysts. And so that's really kind of my world. And so while I was in my PhD program and living in New York City, and Hurricane Sandy happened and Hurricane Irene happened, and I was getting really very alarmed and started to think, okay, I'll see patients in the morning and write about climate in the evening. I thought, I'm going to take kind of an academic, I'm going to do commentary. But then a very good friend of mine said to me, don't start a blog, as I was planning. Discourse isn't enough. Think, what could you do to actually solve this crisis? And truly, my life has never been the same since he said that to me 6 years ago, because I realized that I had never wanted anything more than to do everything that I can to, as we say, cancel the apocalypse and protect humanity and the living world. And since that conversation, my life totally changed. And I started this organization with Ezra and others. And I'm still a psychologist, and this is still a psychological approach. I started with the question, why are we killing ourselves and how do we stop, right? And in some ways, the climate emergency movement is a movement of like going sane, right? Or realizing that our lives are in danger, our lives and those of our loved ones, and no one is coming to save us. We have to do this. And so part of the psychological mindset that I bring to this is a very intense focus on telling the truth. That when I started looking at what other organizations were doing, I was very dismayed by a pattern that really still exists in the movement. I'm sure you guys have encountered it, which is the idea that we can't tell people the truth about climate. We shouldn't tell people the truth because it's too scary and fear doesn't work as a motivator. But there's several problems with that. I honestly consider it one of the worst ideas in the world. But the core problem is, what do you do if you decide in advance that we can't scare people, but the truth is inherently terrifying? And the answer is you don't tell the truth. You euphemize and sugarcoat and tell a partial truth. And that approach has clearly failed. That approach of euphemizing about the crisis on one hand, and then advocating policy ideas that are just like on a different scale, right? So on one hand, So this is the difference between gradualism and climate emergency, climate mobilization framework, right? Gradualism or incrementalism says climate change is a problem or an issue that we need to, take, we need to have a policy measure or measures that gradually improve the problem. And don't bother anybody too much, right? Easy, cheap measures but the climate emergency movement says, no, this is an existential crisis. We are in danger and we need to pull every lever, right? We need huge investment, strong government regulation. For example, we call for banning all new fossil fuel infrastructure. Now, in a sense, this is totally obvious, but it's also at this point in history a like extreme political position. Ban all new fossil fuel infrastructure and shut down what we have in a scheduled way, and do a huge energy conservation program and renewable energy buildup in order to keep the lights on. That it's such a different approach, both in terms of the kinds of communications that we use, telling the truth, even though it is hard, and the kind of policies that we advocate. Okay, so I mean, just that, what is the truth about the climate emergency? The basic reality, the basic risk was laid out best by Lester Brown, who used to work in the federal government, in the Department of Agriculture. That he said, we're going to see, there's so much going on with climate, different, storms and droughts and public health, epidemics. There's all kinds of stuff, but the key thing to watch, the most dangerous thing, is droughts leading to agricultural failure, leading to internal migration, international migration, and also just instability, government instability, leading to instability and failed states. And that's exactly what happened in Syria. They had the worst drought in their history, which caused internal migration and civil war, state failure. So that's what we're facing, is the collapse of civilization into a just apocalyptic, horrible scenario. We have to stop it. We have to do everything that we can as individuals, and then as a whole society and a whole world. We have to transform as quickly as possible. And so the organization, the Climate Mobilization, works on that in a lot of ways. My forthcoming book is a self-help book to try to help people with the emotional and personal elements. And this climate emergency work is those values translated into political organizing and campaigning. And thank you all again for being a part of it.
Thank you so much. That was an incredible awakening for people who just say, well, it's a problem and we'll work on it. Yeah. That doesn't work. And now I'd like to introduce to you Ezra Silk. Ezra is the co-founder and strategy and policy director with the Climate Mobilization. After earning a bachelor's degree in history from Wesleyan University in 2010, Ezra worked as a newspaper reporter covering local government affairs in Down East and Southern Maine. He's reported for the Hartford Courant, the Bar Harbor Times, and the Lakes Region Weekly. Ezra co-founded the Climate Mobilization with Margaret in 2014. 2 years later, published The Victory Plan, an influential exploration of how the federal government could organize and implement America's fair share of the total mobilization to save civilization from the climate emergency and ecological overshoot that has informed the demands of the global Extinction Rebellion movement. Ezra supported TCM's advisory board chair, Russell Green, in drafting language that was added to the 2016 Democratic Party platform and the 2018 Democratic National Committee platform declaring a global climate emergency and calling for a mobilization on the scale of World War II in response. For the past 2 years, Ezra has worked closely with the LEAP LA Coalition and the Office of Council Member Paul Koretz on building a partnership to launch a groundbreaking climate emergency mobilization program in the city of Los Angeles that also redresses the city's long history of racial and economic oppression. Additionally, he works to spread the climate emergency campaign across the world. Ezra, welcome, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Geri. I really appreciate you guys having me on the call tonight. Thank you so much. So what Margaret talked about was how do we switch psychologically into facing the truth and to an emergency type of response. And it's overwhelming to begin to process that. I think the good news here is that societies and governments actually, we have practice in switching into emergency mode. So I've spent a lot of time studying what happened in the US in World War II. And basically what happened was the government, once the public woke up after Pearl Harbor, said, look, the market economy is not going to be able to deal with this threat quickly enough, and we're going to take over in some fashion or another a large portion of the economy to redirect it towards munitions production, conservation, exporting our technology, our weapons overseas, and rapidly mobilizing a massive army. And that's what we're talking about, that type of approach here. The problem is the government's not prepared to do that right now, even though that's what we need to do. We are getting very late in the game. Climate greenhouse gas emissions have gone up 60% since Jim Hansen globally testified before Congress in 1988. And there's tipping points that are being transgressed in the Antarctic and in the Arctic, and potentially in the Arctic permafrost. So we may be getting dangerously close to this thing getting out of control. And so that's why we talk about a whole economy, whole of government type of response. And that's what we mean when we say a mobilization. So when faced with this knowledge of this necessity back in 2017, after Donald Trump had become elected president, we decided to pivot to a local government first response. And basically the approach of trying to get local governments to declare a climate emergency and then do everything they could to both roll out climate solutions within their jurisdiction, and then to persuade other cities to declare a climate emergency, and then higher levels of government as well. And so we first worked on this, particularly in California and the city of Los Angeles, with a coalition there called the LEAP LA Coalition. And then it began to spread to other parts of the country, including Hoboken, New Jersey, which is the first city to declare a climate emergency, and then Montgomery County. So since then, there's now over 1,080 local governments, local and national governments. There's a few national governments that have declared a state of climate emergency that stemmed out of this campaign. And we view this idea of declaring a climate emergency as a fundamental first step towards mobilizing. The Extinction Rebellion talks about the need to tell the truth. And this is what we see governments doing when they declare a climate emergency, usually under pressure from their constituents to do so. But it's just a first step. What's absolutely needed is follow-on climate emergency action to actually address the problem at scale. So in terms of this campaign, it's really taken off over the last year. I believe there's about 43 cities that have declared a climate emergency in the US. And during the climate strikes over the last few weeks, there were 30 new local climate emergency campaigns that were launched, about 30 across the US, and we were not aware of many of them. So it's kind of becoming going viral, it seems like, in the US now. And there were also a number of state level campaigns that were launched in places you might expect, like Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, Washington State, but also Wisconsin and Alabama. There were campaigns launched to get the state to declare a state of climate emergency. And these are taking on different forms in different places. So they're sometimes rolled in with other demands. But in terms of our framework, when we're talking about a local government declaring climate emergency, we want them to be committing to basically ending greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, beginning a safe program to remove carbon from the atmosphere, because we now have way too much carbon in the atmosphere for safety, towards a general goal of reversing climate change and restoring a safe climate, dealing with the broader ecological crisis, and then following that up with immediate action. So we call it ban, plan, and expand. So the basic idea is that local governments in particular have tools that they can use to phase out fossil fuel infrastructure. For instance, there's a campaign in Los Angeles right now to get neighborhood oil drilling effectively banned. And that's within the authority of the local government. The city of Berkeley, after declaring a climate emergency, they said, okay, we've recognized the climate emergency, and we're now going to pass an ordinance that prevents any new buildings from using natural gas. So that building electrification ordinance that the city of Berkeley tied to their climate emergency declaration is now being considered by a number of cities across the country. So we strongly recommend that cities, after declaring a climate emergency, explore those kinds of climate emergency actions that are cost effective and immediately start to address the problem at the source. Then we talk about plan. In LA, they've created a set of community assemblies to consult with the community about the climate emergency, to educate the community about the climate emergency, and to generate solutions together that are rooted in the experiences of communities. We also recommend starting a climate emergency mobilization body. The LA has created an Office of Climate Emergency Mobilization that was paired with their climate emergency declaration to start to plan out the citywide response. And then finally, we talk about expand. So it's not going to be enough for local governments to do what they can. They can't do everything. They have limited resources. They have some tools, but not all tools. So it's absolutely essential that as we start the process of government switching into emergency mode by getting local governments to declare and to follow up on their declarations, that we don't get stuck in parochialism and get too stuck in the nitty-gritty of local policies and politics, but really try to get, we should both campaign for higher levels of government to declare a climate emergency and roll out climate emergency programs, but also get governments to advocate upwards. So for instance, our climate emergency declaration template calls on the local congressional delegation that the city is represented by to sign on to the National Climate Emergency Declaration resolution that has been introduced into Congress a couple of weeks ago. So we see all these things kind of working together and putting pressure on higher levels of government, including the federal government, to declare an emergency and get started on the response. Let's see. Yeah, I think that we have to keep in mind with this that the climate emergency declaration is a tactic. It's the first step. Ultimately, what we need to get to is this massive scale of response that we haven't seen since World War II, that will be a federal government-led response, but it will be implemented at state and local levels as well. So we're really pleased at the level of traction this climate emergency campaign has gotten. We think that in many ways it's started to work. It's sent a strong signal to society at large that this is an existential emergency situation. It's given more credibility to that concept. But there's a lot more power that needs to be built behind it in order to make it real and get governments to really follow through on this commitment. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Ezra. So now you're waiting to hear, well, what do we do? How do we impact this? So I'm going to introduce to you Rebecca Harris, who is a dynamic organizer, has been working for social justice since the age of 15, when she became involved in the peace movement in her hometown of Salem, Oregon. Since then, she's worked as a journalist covering equity in Chicago public schools and organized for housing rights and racial justice. Rebecca joined the climate mobilization in February 2018, bringing a background in training, facilitation, fundraising, and strategic communications. She's a 2017 graduate of the Reframe Mentorship in Strategic Communications and a 2019 participant in the Ann Braden Organizer Training Program. Most recently, Rebecca has worked as Development and Communications Manager at the Latino Union of Chicago, an immigrants and worker rights organization. Okay, Rebecca, over to you, and you can tell us what we do about this.
Thanks so much, Geri. So we're really excited to have the chance to connect with all of you this evening and share some tools for how you can plug in to this climate emergency push. So like Ezra mentioned, we're in a very exciting moment where dozens of new local climate emergency campaigns are getting started and are actually working in dozens of US cities and counties, pushing local governments to respond to the climate emergency. And they're working at the local level, and we're working at the local level all around the US to get local governments to respond to the emergency by passing a climate emergency declaration that sets the agenda, that commits local governments to reaching zero emissions, to working to restore a safe climate, to ending fossil fuel extraction and ending the burning of fossil fuels, and then working to implement the declaration and follow through on the agenda they've set, follow through on the commitments that they've gotten their local government to make. And our premise in this work is that in any type of emergency, right, if our neighborhood were on fire, we'd be going door to door, pulling our neighbors to safety, and we'd be getting our neighbors to help. And we'd be working together to get everyone in our communities involved. And we feel like we need to approach the climate emergency in the same way, by getting everyone involved and giving everyone a role. Another premise we have is that the more people we get involved, we have a better shot of all surviving. We have a better shot of responding to the emergency as a society, because more people and groups involved means more power to change the government's direction. And through local campaigns, we are lining up groups, lining up individuals to push at all levels and to build a larger movement responding to the climate emergency. We work with existing organizations that could be Elders Climate Action chapters or other local climate groups, and we support them in building their power in numbers through local climate emergency campaigns, and in pushing at the city level, at the county level, and then moving to pushing for state and federal climate emergency response. So you might be asking, what are those tools and what are the supports that we can share for you in starting your climate emergency campaign? So we have developed a toolkit and recipe book for local climate emergency campaigns that give folks a clear step-by-step process to follow. So this is a timeline that we have built out for how folks can start a climate emergency campaign in their community. And we actually have guides written out fully for each of these steps. We have some trainings available as well that we'll talk more about in a minute. But we have materials and support available to guide folks through step by step, through reaching out to partner organizations, building relationships with other groups in their community. We also have a training curriculum that's available for folks running climate emergency campaigns to bring in new members, train people on the climate emergency, engage people in learning about the emergency, in reflecting on their values, and in really making commitments for what they want to do and how they can take action in their community. And then we have guides on meeting with local officials, on starting neighborhood groups, and on planning actions as well. And as I mentioned, we will be sharing with all of you a link that you can use to download our climate emergency campaign guide. So you will get access to our 2-hour workshop curriculum that you can use to share a climate emergency campaign with other folks in your community, access to our guide to reaching out to partner organizations, starting neighborhood groups, welcoming new members, and doing outreach to invite new people in to join your campaign. We also, as the Climate Mobilization, hold twice a month online training calls where we work through all of the materials in the Climate Emergency Campaign Guide, topic by topic, step by step, really supporting organizers around the US who want their communities to respond to the climate emergency and what each step of the process should be. And we have also just developed a 2-day in-person organizing training that we can offer in collaboration with organizations around the US that really trains folks up in some of these skills and processes around how to start a climate emergency campaign, what that can look like, and how to get as many people as possible in your community involved in pushing for an emergency response. So we have a sign-up form that we have created in partnership with Elders Climate Action. It's at tinyurl.com/eldersrespond. And if you'd like to get some of these resources and materials around starting your own climate emergency campaign, you can go there, plug in your information. You'll get our climate emergency campaign guide. You'll get a recording of our Getting Started call on how to start a climate emergency campaign. And you'll also get a sign-up link for our next upcoming online training, which is on October 23rd. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I believe the link is on our website to sign up is in the chat box. So if you go to the chat, you can find that link. We have definitely got time for questions and answers. There's some comments too that I'd like to read out to you guys though. This is from Marilyn Price, who's in Marin County, and she sits in on your webinars, and she is starting to get the Marin cities to declare a climate emergency. And she's also a longtime ECA member and diligently works on environmental issues more than full-time, I must say. So just so you know.
Awesome.
Yeah, it is. And another of our viewers is Todd Weber, and he's letting us know that California, Santa Clara County, and the city of San Jose have just in past weeks each separately issued climate emergency declarations. San Jose also just passed REACH codes, which is building electrification measures, and Santa Clara is still working on such. So to answer the question that Philip had, here is what you can do in order to plug into this and work with ECA and the climate emergency to start pushing at local levels. And it's really, we know that at the federal level, we're not going to have much impact right now, but the more cities and counties that step up and really declare this will send a unified message up the ladder. Ezra.
Yeah, I just want to build on that because we've been pushing Congress to declare a climate emergency. There's a resolution that's been introduced, as I mentioned. And when I did mention to members of Congress that there is a city that had declared a climate emergency in their district, they definitely took note of that. It definitely sends a strong signal that there is support within their district, which is all they care about, so primarily.
Right. So here's a way to sort of push the feds and members of Congress to take action when they prefer inaction, just by pushing up from the local level. So let's see the questions. So I'm not sure who would be able to answer this, or we may have to research it. The World Bank reports 20 cities have a price on carbon. Do you know who they are besides Tokyo?
No, we don't actually advocate the price on carbon because we see it as a kind of too slow for the emergency situation in terms of reducing emissions. So we advocate more direct regulations to just directly reduce emissions.
Okay, I'm looking to see if there's any more questions. Reva Freilich from Baldwin County. CCL encourages participants to join with CCL as a partner organization. They'll be holding a lobbying meeting on on Zoom through their website. That was just a kind of a thank you for doing this. So there was another question looking for list of things that cities can do to increase price on greenhouse gas emissions, which is a solution. If people believe that that's the solution, it doesn't send us down the path to any real solutions that are likely to happen. In South Portland, Maine, the City Council heard our youth who spoke very articulately in behalf of climate emergency resolution and action, and the entire City Council passed this resolution.
It's fantastic. I saw that Lynn asked about actions that can be taken after a climate emergency declaration. So I posted in the chat something called Ban, Plan, and Expand. We're going to be releasing a further report on this, but I kind of described it earlier, which is the idea of cities can ban certain processes, fossil fuel extraction. They can mandate that buildings, don't use natural gas. There's other kinds of things that can be done. Plan is getting a really deliberative planning process going to fully engage the community in planning an emergency response. Creating a task force or even a full city department devoted to this. And then Expand is the idea I touched on earlier of cities can advocate. They can tell higher levels of government. They can request that they declare a climate emergency. They can request that they develop climate emergency legislation. So there's a whole bunch of things cities can do, and there's a lot of experimentation going on around that right now, which is exciting. But yeah, check out the link.
And to build on what Ezra just said, we also find that it's even more important once a city has already passed a climate emergency declaration to keep, for the organizers that have worked towards that declaration, to keep building power, keep building more groups and getting more groups and more individuals involved so that they're able to then follow through and hold the city or the county accountable to the promises that it's made.
Yeah, I would just respond to Leslie Wharton's comment about how well have cities, counties, states that have declared climate emergencies been in actually implementing the policies that the climate emergency mandates. And I would say it's largely a function of the amount of power that's behind these climate emergency declarations, the coalition, the level of organization, et cetera, the intensity of support that has determined where these things have really resulted in serious commitments from government. In my view, getting to the national level right now, it's needed, but it's a bit premature just because our movement's not strong enough. So that's why one of the reasons we're so excited about these local campaigns.
Thank you. I have a question. Are you seeing much in the way of building code changes when after a climate emergency has been declared in cities, or do you not really have that information?
Well, Berkeley was really the first one to do that, and now a number of other cities are considering it, and it may include some cities that haven't declared a climate emergency. But I don't have the figures on exactly which cities at the moment. So
I would be thinking that that's a real key, is to get, and that's a slow process, to get building codes changed and land development codes changed, but is key to part of looking forward to not increasing greenhouse gases. It doesn't certainly decrease them in any real way necessarily, but
yeah, more stops the buildup from increasing even further.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. Great. Let's see. There's some more questions. Actually, don't see any more questions. Do either of you have any closing comments that you would like to make?
Well, someone's saying here that we've exhausted them with the sense of overwhelm. I think what's the positive story of what could a turnaround look like? I mean, I just say, look around you. I mean, look at the movement that's emerging all over the world that's talking in these kind of terms around a climate emergency, that we need a mobilization. I think people are really, once they understand the stakes, are rising to the challenge in a really exciting way that we haven't seen before in the last 30, 40 years. So that's where I see hope. Yeah, that's about it though. So.
Great. Rebecca.
Yeah, I agree with what Ezra said. I see hope in the dozens of new campaigns we're seeing start demanding that governments respond to the climate emergency. I had the privilege of spending last weekend in the room with about 25 climate emergency organizers from around the US who we were training, folks from Colorado, folks from Minnesota, New York, and a number of other states. And it was just incredible to see the energy and the passion and the commitment that's developed around this, and that so many people, including so many people on the line here with us tonight, hold. And it's inspiring to see the work that everyone has put in and the passion and the commitment.
Thank you. There's another note in the chat that as cities pass REACH codes and electrification codes, fossil fuel industry and suppliers will launch some significant disinformation campaigns in the media to try and sabotage those. Have you seen any of that?
So we're not actually that focused on this. I mean, the Berkeley thing is exciting, but we're not that focused on this specific measure. This is just like one example. I will say this just goes back to the issue of building power and the need to have a really strong base pushing this. One thing though that cities can do is their own public information campaigns to educate people in their jurisdiction around the climate emergency. So I was in Washington, DC Metro a few weeks ago, and there's big signs in the Metro talking about how taking the Metro is better in terms of CO2, and here's all the horrible things that CO2 does. So, I mean, there's all kinds of things they could be doing to counter that, this kind of disinformation that we could be pushing local governments to do. So, and in terms of XR, there's someone that asked how we're relating to XR. Rebecca, do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. So our tools and our support for climate emergency campaigns are available not just to climate mobilization chapters. They're available to anyone, any chapter of any organization or any group of people that wants to run a climate emergency campaign. So in that capacity, we work with and support a number of XR chapters with their climate emergency campaigns. XR, Extinction Rebellion groups are able to access our materials, our trainings, and we're also partnering with Extinction Rebellion on the National Climate Emergency Declaration campaign. And the website for that is climateemergency.us. I'll pop that into the chat box.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So ECA members, chapters, small groups can sign up can engage with you, and you will provide basically all the materials that they need, all of the training and support that they need as they go through the process of getting in their local communities with trying to engage their city or municipality, town, or whatever they live in with the climate emergency and try and get that passed. I'm also wondering if this is a great opportunity to for elders to partner with youth together and go to, because I think there's some power of having elders and youth doing presentations at city council meetings or town council meetings or commission meetings, whatever it is that you have. And also on a side note, that even if you aren't able to engage initially a community, and you guys tell me if this is a wrong approach, most municipal organizations at their meetings have some time for public comment and public participation. So generally that's available. You need to find out how and where to do that, but that's a way to put sort of the word and just the thought in the commission's mind if you don't have immediate access. I think that that's a possible way to be successful and just as an entree. I don't know if that's part of your training or if you've used that strategy at all, Rebecca.
It's not part of our training, but it is a great way to get the ball rolling. We also have guides on identifying and reaching out to organizations, getting in conversation with other groups in your community around the idea of the climate emergency, and guides to identifying individuals and other folks that you can work with on starting one of these campaigns.
Great.
I would just say, Geri, that the intergenerational thing is very powerful. We just did two days of lobbying on this in DC with the intergenerational group on the National Declaration resolution. And what we're seeing is that, I live in Maine and I was at the climate strike here in Portland. And I was just totally shocked when this 13-year-old got up on the podium and called on the mayor of Portland and South Portland to declare a climate emergency. And she's like leading the charge, it seems like. So I would encourage people to connect with their local climate strike organizers, youth organizers, because I think this is a demand that really has a lot of traction with young people right now. Greta Thunberg's been using this language heavily and been promoting this tactic. So yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Oh, I have another question. This is on a specific solution, and that is, does climate emergency support geoengineering?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different things that people talk about in terms of geoengineering, in terms of removing carbon or reflecting sunlight. We don't think that the technology in terms of reflecting sunlight has been developed to the extent that it should be used. We do think the situation is severe enough that we may require some research to determine whether something like that will be necessary to prevent runaway global warming. But we don't advocate its use at this point. No.
I have another couple of questions, if you'll bear with us. What are some of the first actions that a local government can do to start to implement a plan to address the climate emergency?
Yeah, so I think we've hit on some of these, but I definitely think coming up, doing a deliberative planning process with the community is key. Coming up with the climate mobilization action plan, creating a body such as a task force or potentially a department. If there's enough support for that, that's a heavy duty action. And then some of these, I think the building electrification thing that Berkeley passed is a great first step. It's been demonstrated as something that's gaining a lot of traction. We would classify it as an emergency action, and we would just want to make sure that the timeline for that is fast, like, having it done within the next year. So. Great.
Your project has expanded enormously over the past 2 years. What are you projecting for expansion over the next 2 years? What does that look like for you?
But for the organization?
Yeah.
So, Rebecca.
Yeah, I mean, we are looking to seed and support dozens more climate emergency campaigns around the US, and to support more and more organizations, and also taking on the push for a climate emergency response. So a lot of our role we see as support and training and capacity building for the climate emergency movement.
But in terms of the outcome we would like to see and that we would like to contribute to, we would like to see the federal government mobilizing on the scale we're talking about in under 2 years. So, yeah.
And that is a timeline that can be met based on the will to meet it.
Yes, well said.
Here's somebody who feels like the sense of overwhelm is exhausting. Do you have a positive story of what a turnaround could look like?
Yeah, so that we addressed that earlier. We were talking about the new emerging movement is giving us hope. So.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank you all very much for being here, and I'm hoping that we will have a long-lasting relationship and we'll be supporting you, and we'll have chapters, members. We've got some new chapters actually starting, so it's in some vicinities where it may make some sense for a chapter to kind of get together and you know, have an action that they can immediately embark upon. So, and it's something that's kind of a team building thing for them too while they're starting. So we really appreciate that, and I'm hoping that some people will sign up. We'll stay in touch. I hope everybody has enjoyed this webinar. This is the first of 2 webinars. Our next webinar is on climate justice on October 22nd at the same time. I hope you can all join us. We have Reverend Michael Malcolm, who will be presenting at that webinar, and it promises to be a very exciting and full of information for you, really based on environmental justice, particularly in the South, where it's very, very heavily impacted, and it's more like environmental injustice in the South. So I hope that you will be able to join us. I also hope that if you've enjoyed these webinars, we don't charge for them, but we would really appreciate any small donations that you can make to support us so that we can continue the work that we do. I'd like to thank Ezra, Rebecca, Carol, and Margaret, and we'll be seeing each other all again. And thank you all, and good day.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. Have a good
Thank
night.
you.
Yeah.